Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 10th, 1984, the United States and the Vatican established full diplomatic relations for the first time in 117 years. We'll get into some of the details, but the U.S. and the Vatican had ties from George Washington, the beginning of the country, up until 1867, and then Congress passed a law banning funding for any formal diplomatic relations with the Holy See. And then from 1867 all the way to 1984, there were some informal meetings and personal envoys, but it wasn't until this day in 1984, under President Reagan, that a formal ambassador was appointed to the Vatican, then headed up by Pope John Paul II. So, here to talk about that moment and our relations, formal and informal, with the Vatican is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody. I am your local Catholic correspondent.
Okay, great. So we have this moment in 1984, but let's actually go back to 1867 because that is the last time there were formal ties. What happens in 1867 that the United States says, we don't want a formal relationship with the Vatican anymore?
You know, there's not like a distinct thing that happens. It's just that there's this rising anti-Catholic sentiment, and this is one of the places that it expresses itself. And so a lot of this is tied to the influx of immigrants from Europe, a lot of Italian and German immigrants who are bringing Catholicism with them, and a real bigotry in the United States about Catholicism and a fear of Catholicism as something that is fundamentally anti-democratic and un-American.
Yeah, and is that centered in the Northeast where a lot of new immigrants were coming, or is there also a sort of, I mean, you think 1867, you certainly think Reconstruction. Is there a post-Civil War context to this as well?
I mean, it's certainly happening all across the country because, you know, yes, in the Northeast where there are immigrants, but also in the South, which is a heavily Protestant area, in the Midwest where a lot of new immigrants are settling. So this is not necessarily a localized phenomenon. It becomes pretty quickly an across-the-country phenomenon.
Right. And certainly if you read about things like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and so forth, there's a deep anti-Catholic sentiment in there. So as you were saying, it's just sort of throughout the country, there's this real suspicion and conspiracy theories and all these kind of insidious stories about Catholicism as this threat.
Yeah, I mean, there's this real fear that Catholics are fundamentally loyal to the Pope over any political leader. And so they're taking orders from the Pope that if it comes to choosing between the United States and Rome, they'll choose Rome, that they're trying to get funding for Catholic schools. The Catholics are both trying to take over the United States, but also fundamentally disloyal to the United States. And that's the rhetoric that you hear pretty much anywhere in the country in the late 19th century. It becomes a slogan, an opposition to Rum and Romanism, as anti-Catholicism was known at the time. That's, part of an anti-immigrant push, but also part of a defense of the United States as a fundamentally Protestant country.
Right. And, it's a reminder that, I think for certainly in the last generation or maybe two, when you think of religious divides in this country, you often think of Christianity and other religions, and, obviously Islam is a big part of the sort of our political conversation around religion now. This is a reminder that for so long it was Protestants and Catholics was the real big cleaving within this country, within Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anti-Semitism becomes pretty big in the United States, particularly in the early 20th century, as there are more immigrants from places like Eastern Europe. But certainly for the 19th century and, well into the 20th century, the anti-Catholicism in the U.S. is a defining feature of American politics.
And, when you think about what you were saying, these rumors about Catholics being more loyal to the Pope, I mean, certainly in modern political times, it's the JFK election that seems to be the big flashpoint for that. I mean, that was the big story around JFK rising to political power, right?
Right. So we should say that Catholics made their political home in the Democratic Party. And so they began in the 20th century to exercise some power there. In 1928, you get your first Catholic candidate in Al Smith, who actually loses pretty badly. So when John Kennedy comes along, there is this sense that, will Protestants actually vote for a Catholic? It's not particularly clear. And so he goes out of his way to make clear that, I don't have a loyalty to the Catholic Church. I'm not going to, he actually says that he's not going to extend diplomatic relations to the Catholic Church because he doesn't want to bear the taint of Catholicism when he is running for president.
Right. And then when he becomes president, I mean, you would think that we have decades and decades at this point, almost a century of not having diplomatic ties with the Vatican. You would think we finally have our first Catholic president. He would be the one to take that step. But as you were saying, I think he was so cowed by this charge and overcorrecting to not feed this rumor that he was kind of almost the worst candidate to take that step.
That's right. And he was also informed by something that had happened just a few years earlier. In 1951, Harry Truman had floated the idea of reestablishing these diplomatic relations. And what happens? His Baptist pastor denounces him publicly. And there's this huge pushback from Protestants in the country. So even just a few years earlier, the sentiment against embracing anything that seemed Catholic was still suspicious in the United States and came at a political cost.
Yeah. So before we get to what happens in the 1980s and this changes, we've been talking mostly about the domestic considerations, often political considerations, or at least political refracted through religion. There is an element of what's happening in Italy and the Vatican's role as both a diplomatic state and a religious state, which I will say is often something that has kind of been curious to me, that it's able to or tries to walk these two sides. But, it does seem like that plays a pretty key part in the U.S. never taking that step, at least for 150 years or so, of establishing formal ties.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the late 1860s, 1870s were a huge moment in Italian history. In 1871, the reunification process begins. But part of that process is the papal states, which were actually a pretty significant part of what would become Italy, are disbanded. And the Catholic Church, instead of controlling this large territory that could have diplomatic relationships with another country for a lot of reasons, gets shrunk down to this tiny little city-state. And so when it comes to reestablishing diplomatic relations with the Vatican, it's a very different prospect because it's no longer a political state. It's just a religious state in a lot of ways. It's just this tiny little spot on the map. And it's not the same kind of motivation to develop diplomatic relationships with what is fundamentally a religious state, which would have been the only religion that the U.S. had formal diplomatic ties to.
Right. So if it had remained part of larger Italy, you could almost under the guise of relations with Italy have a sort of deeper relationship with the U.S. government and Catholicism, but because it gets narrowed down to just this state, it becomes a little trickier politically. Right,
because the papal state had ports and it controlled land and it had exports, whereas, again, Vatican City is just this tiny little place.
Yeah, for sure. So we get now to the early 80s. There's a larger geopolitical context, but it also really does seem to have a lot to do with two people, President Reagan and Pope John Paul II, and a kind of relationship between the two of them to just kind of get this thing done.
Yeah, I mean, they really admire one another. And I think that's in part because of some shared experiences and some shared political beliefs. I mean, they come to power around the same time. Pope John Paul II becomes pope in 1978. Ronald Reagan becomes president in January of 1981. They both survive assassination attempts within just a few weeks of one another. But I think that the thing that really glues them together is that geopolitical force that you're talking about, which is communism. I mean, the thing that defined Pope John Paul II, who was a Polish pope, was his very visible and very vocal opposition to the Soviet regime and to communist governments in a way that Reagan, who was this big Cold Warrior, really found appealing.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like whenever we talk about something that happens in I guess anytime between the 50s and the 80s on this show, it's like we have this conversation, we talk about all the nuances, and then it's like paper covering rock in rock, paper, scissors. Fear of communism just comes in. It's like, oh, right. Yes, that's the thing. But that really does seem to be the key element here.
Yeah, I mean, we often think about it, too, in terms of Europe and Eastern Europe, but it also had real implications for Latin America, which is a place that Reagan was really interested in as well. In Latin America, you had the rise of liberation theology and this left-wing Catholicism, and Pope John Paul II denounces that. He says it's not legitimate, and so they're in alignment on the politics of the theology in Latin America.
Yeah, super fascinating story of how religion and anti-communist efforts in Latin America play out. So what about domestically? Does the fact that we have Reagan reaching out and starting to thaw these ties and build some formal ties, does that indicate any shift in the kind of dynamic we were talking about that had existed for the previous 100 years or so about suspicions between Catholics and Protestants domestically?
Yeah, I think it reflects a really important shift that was happening. First, anti-Catholicism as a force in American life begins to die out in the 1950s and 1960s. But I think more importantly, for this story, Catholics had largely been part of the Democratic Party, but over the course of the 60s and 70s and 80s, it begins to shift to more of a 50-50 balance. After Kennedy, it becomes possible to imagine Catholics voting for a Republican. Nixon takes advantage of this. He wins in 1972 a majority of the Catholic vote, and Reagan is hoping to do that as well. And he has reason to suspect that he can, because remember that Catholics were the base of anti-communism in the United States. Some of the most important conservatives in the 50s and 60s, like Bill Buckley and Joe McCarthy and Phyllis Schlafly, were all Catholic anti-communists. And so there was an alliance to be forged, and it's Reagan who finally takes the step of bringing those Catholics into the Republican Party.
And it's a reminder that, these alliances get forged around big issues and big priorities, right? And so as we do throughout all of our political alliances, often people put aside their differences. And if anti-communism is certainly a galvanizing enough issue that it's going to bring people together, I think we see that with abortion now, that you see sort of interesting bedfellows religiously and culturally around that issue. I mean, throughout time, there's these just singular issues that tie people together.
Abortion is such an important part of this story because, even as anti-Catholicism was dying off, there was still real tension between Catholics and especially white evangelicals. And in the fights over things like abortion in the 1970s and 1980s, you start to see alliances shifting so that it's no longer Protestant versus Catholic. It's liberal Protestant and liberal Catholic versus conservative Protestant and conservative Catholic. And that new sort of ecumenicism within conservative circles is something that Reagan is appealing to as well.
Yeah. So what does this move actually mean? So we now have formal diplomatic relations with the Vatican. I presume that means there's now an ambassador.
There is.
Does it mean anything else in the real world, or is it more just this sort of symbolic shift, a reflection of a shift, or does it actually change anything on the ground?
I mean, look, it doesn't change really anything in the United States other than for those people like Callista Gingrich who get to become ambassador to Vatican City. But for the Vatican, it meant something. At the time that this happened, they had been working really hard to get diplomatic recognition. Over 100 countries already recognized the Vatican, but the big ones, China, the Soviet Union, the United States, did not. They weren't going to get China and the Soviet Union anytime soon, but the United States was really where they were aiming. So it didn't really matter for the U.S., but it mattered a lot to the Vatican.
And then, of course, over time, I mean, once you have formal relations, then that also means that there are kind of formal ways to forge ties and to express disagreement. And so, over time, for instance, in 2009, the ambassadorship was vacant because there were tensions between the Vatican and the Obama administration over the issues of abortion and same-sex marriage. And then there was a formal moving of an embassy during the Obama administration. I think it's just a reminder that now all of a sudden the Vatican is in the sort of machinery of diplomatic relations that gets expressed with other countries. Now you kind of have all these religious questions that sort of get hashed out in that way too. And so it adds this other interesting element.
Yeah, that meshing of religion and politics becomes unavoidable once you have these formal diplomatic ties. There was a lot of concern in the Vatican as well. Though they wanted this diplomatic recognition, some Catholics feared that the U.S. would have too much power over the Vatican, that they would have too much influence. Ultimately, you have these moments, as you were just talking about, where there's real pushback and the Vatican is able to assert its independence. That shows that they were able to withstand some of those influences.
Yeah. You did mention Callista Gingrich, who is our current ambassador to the Vatican. She, of course, is Newt Gingrich's wife. You look at the list of ambassadors to the Vatican, and it does seem to be on the, how should we put it, the circuit of maybe cushy ambassador jobs. I mean, certainly people who have been ambassadors have been theologians, or there was the head of Catholic Charities, but a number of the people who have been ambassadors to the Vatican were also people who were ambassadors to Portugal the year before and ambassadors to other countries the year before. It's on the circuit.
Yes.
And I would imagine it's probably a pretty cushy job. Certainly if you're a Catholic, it's probably a real thrill of a lifetime. But at the very least, another position to give to a friend for a couple of years.
Yes, think of it as more of the Luxembourg or Liechtenstein kind of ambassadorship versus ambassador to China.
Where would you accept your ambassadorship?
I kind of like the idea of Luxembourg because it gives you the ambassadorship. You're in Europe, you can travel. There's this kind of comfort level, but you don't have to do very much. You don't have to worry about war breaking out between the U.S. and Luxembourg.
That's correct.
What about you?
I don't know, some island nations, although I guess you probably have to deal with climate change now. I knew someone who worked for the ambassador to Palau, and it was a very cushy job until about 10, 15 years ago, where all of a sudden it was our country is about to go underwater, and now this actually matters. But until then, it was here, go live on a tropical island for a couple years.
Yeah, if I wasn't just looking for a cushy job with no responsibilities, I think something, I lived in Australia for a while, Australia or New Zealand would be pretty amazing, both as livability.
Yeah, too much threat of actual responsibility in that one, I would say. Yes.
Fair enough.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with our transcripts. You can find those at thisdaypod.com, where you can also find a forum to get in touch, leave us any comments about the show, or suggest possible topics for future shows. You can also email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.